I hope you have all had a fantastic week. I hope you've had a fun weekend. And I hope that you're excited as we start this new series in our student ministry called The Storyteller. In this series, we're going to see how Jesus used stories to connect and convey both his message and his ministry to all humanity. And as we go through 4 different parables, I truly believe that we will all see ourselves, Jesus, and our faith much more clearly. Mostly due to the way that Jesus just told his stories. Stories are powerful, and they're one of the oldest ways of conveying information, knowledge, and wisdom. Stories are told through music. They're written on cave walls. They're written on clay tablets and clay pots. They're written on canvases. Stories are written on paper. They're told around a campfire, and they're presented to us online, at movies, and on TV. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. Stories are amazing. And did you know that science has discovered that the human brain is much more engaged, involved, absorbent, receptive, and engaged whenever someone tells or hears a story? Now, Jesus obviously knew the power of a story because he told 40 different stories in his ministry. We're going to be looking at some of those stories. One of them that we look at today is probably one of the most popular stories Jesus ever told. But before we do that, I would like to share something special with you, an opportunity to hear from someone very important when it comes to understanding Jesus' stories, Jesus' parables, and why they are in the Bible. Toby? Thank you, Toby. Yes, as we begin this series called The Storyteller, digging deeper into the parables that Jesus gave us, we thought that it'd be a wise choice to spend a little bit of time and figure out what it is, what a parable is, and why Jesus chose to use them. As we looked for people that could give us insight, we landed on one specific person that we felt could give us very good insight on what a parable is. So I would like to introduce you to the evangelist known as Luke. Luke, it's nice to meet you, or should I call you Dr. Luke?
Luke is perfectly fine.
Fantastic. Luke, what I would like to do is I'd like to ask you a few questions
Certainly.
as we start this series called The Storyteller. The first question is this. Could you tell us what is a parable?
A parable is literally something that's cast alongside something else. Jesus' parables were stories that were cast along a truth in order to illustrate that truth. His parables were teaching aids and can be thought of as extended analogies or inspired comparisons. A common description of a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. I think that's what I would say.
Yes, I've heard it. I've absolutely heard it put that way. Now, when it comes to Jesus telling these parables, why do you think Jesus chose to use parables?
Oh, yes. Jesus knew the power of his ministry and message, but he also knew the power of a good story.
That he did, and he was fantastic at it. Am I right, y'all? So, the next question I have is this. Why does it seem like many of Jesus' parables were a little bit challenging and kind of strange?
They are peculiar indeed, designed for deeper inspection and interpretation for those desiring to discover the truth about Jesus Christ.
That's really insightful. Could you tell us how many parables do you think Jesus actually told?
I believe somewhere
during
around
this time?
35, but I was only moved by the Holy Spirit to cover 24 of them myself.
Right. So in your writings, were there any parables that Jesus gave that specifically moved you more than any others?
They all moved me, but I don't have any absolute favorites, but I like to say that I've always been moved by the lost son or the good father. I like to call it lost and found. You call it the prodigal son.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
That is a very powerful,
Indeed.
very powerful parable. As a matter of fact, that's what we're going to be looking at today.
Awesome.
Listen, Luke, thank you very much for your time and your insight and wisdom. We thank you for joining us. It's time for us to move over to the talk, but you're welcome anytime. Thank you for joining us
Praise be with you.
today.
Thank you.
Well, with that, it's time to move over to the talk. So, Toby, you can take it back. Now, Luke, you're a doctor, right? What do you think about this COVID-19 thing going on with us? Thank you, guys. Yes, today we begin our series, The Storyteller, and today we're going to be looking at a parable often called the Prodigal Son. It's a story about lost and found. And today we're going to see how you don't have to follow a bunch of rules or be all fixed up to be found. In this parable, Jesus is going to unpack and completely flip everyone's understanding about themselves and their sin, about Jesus and salvation. It is an awesome parable. And I really think that this parable, this story, is going to connect with most of us because we all have that story of lost and found. Something that we loved, that we lost, and we looked for, and we finally found. And the great joy and excitement that followed finding something that was lost. Speaking of stories, about 2 years ago, I had just bought a brand new house. And along with a brand new house, I got a brand new puppy. This puppy's name was Scrappy, and he was every bit of Scrappy. He was funny, he was fluffy, he was furry, and he was Scrappy. And Scrappy was one of the smallest dogs I have ever owned. Now, I had just bought this new house, and I was heading to work, and I let Scrappy outside. When I came home, there was no Scrappy. See, the fence in my backyard was just a little too tall, and Scrappy snuck out underneath the fence. I went looking for Scrappy all over the place, and I couldn't find him anywhere. And I started to get really nervous. I started walking out yelling, "Scrappy, Scrappy!" No response. I started knocking on doors, asking my neighbors, "Hey, have you seen my dog? Have you seen my dog?" No one had seen Scrappy. I got in my car and I started driving through the neighborhood looking for my puppy. I could not find him anywhere. I even called animal control and said, "Hey, has anybody called about a little white puppy?" Nothing. Now, I did receive some messages that there was a dead puppy on the highway, and I should probably go take a look. And every time I drove out there, I had to prepare myself to see my little puppy dead. But thankfully, every time, it wasn't Scrappy. He was gone the entire day. I was really sad. I was worried, I was anxious, and kind of panicked because my puppy was gone. I sat down that night, put in the movie Homeward Bound, just hoping that my little puppy Scrappy would be as successful as those two dogs and that cat and somehow make his way home. And at about 1:30 in the morning, I finally fell asleep. And then at 1:46 in the morning, I hear this noise at my front door. I hear this whimpering, I hear this scratching, and I jump up and I run to the front door. And as I open up the door, who is it? Yes, it's Scrappy. He is covered in cow poop, covered in burrs. He smells and looks terrible. And you know what I did? I picked him up, I hugged him, and I kissed him. Why? Why would I do that? Because I was just so happy that my Scrappy had come home to his pappy. I didn't care that he smelled. I didn't care that he was dirty. I didn't care that he broke all the rules. I just cared that my lost puppy had come home. I took him into the kitchen. I cooked him up some garlic chicken pasta, because that's what he likes. I gave him a bath, and he got to sleep in bed with his daddy that night. Why? Because I was just so excited, so happy, and filled with joy that what I loved that was lost was found. In today's parable, Jesus is going to be giving us a vivid picture of God's perspective on how much he loves us and how much he desires a relationship with us and how he will passionately pursue the lost so that they can be found. We're going to look at Luke chapter 15. So right now, run and grab your Bible, open up to Luke 15, and we'll get started. Okay, so here we are in Luke chapter 15. And what I like to do is give you just a little bit of context as we start to read through things. Jesus is right in the middle of his earthly ministry, and he has been traveling, and he's got a great following of people who are kind of curious about Jesus and people who are very critical about Jesus. And Jesus is being pushed around by religious people, but he's being sought out by kind of like the spiritually rebellious people. And after Jesus gives a few different lessons, he has a large crowd gathered all around him. He starts his statements in Luke chapter 15. Verses 1 and 2 say this: Now the tax collectors and the sinners were all gathered around to hear him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." This is the audience, this is the crowd. You have one side, which is the sinful side, and then you have the second side, which is more of the sacred side. The rebellious and the religious. Now, the rebellious side is full of tax collectors. And to give some perspective to that, these are people who have betrayed Jerusalem, betrayed Israel. These people have taken advantage of the people of Jerusalem. They're real slime balls. But then there's also the other sinners. These people are into the categories who are morally, spiritually, and socially known as sinners. They've went completely against God's ways, and God's will, and God's words. And these people are listening to Jesus, and they move closer to Jesus. They actually want to hear from Jesus. They're glad to hear from Jesus. Then you have the religious side. This is the Pharisees. This is the teachers. This is the leaders. These are the moral superiors to everybody. These people are looking in and looking down. They're looking down on all of the sinners, and they're looking down on Jesus. They're not glad at his lesson. They're mad at his lesson because Jesus seems to have an affinity for broken people, for messed up people. And the Pharisees do not like this at all. And during this conversation, you're going to see the crowd kind of move. You're going to see the sinners move in and listen closely, and you're going to see the Pharisees move away. Then you're going to see the Pharisees move in, and the sinners move away. And this constant flow back and forth, Jesus is going to try and communicate to them just what it looks like when a person finally has a relationship with God. So as we move down through the passage, you'll see that Jesus talks about two different parables of lost and found. He talks about a lost sheep and how the shepherd will go out, will leave 99 to go and find the one because he's so passionate to find just that one. And how there's greater celebration in finding just one versus the one that have all the 99 that have been doing everything they're supposed to be doing. And then he talks about how a woman who has a valuable coin and she loses it, and she tears the house apart to find that one coin. And when she finds it, she celebrates. And both of these passages, both of these parables, just reveal to us how passionate God is about finding the lost. And he doesn't care why it's lost, just cares that it's lost. And no parable more clearly exposes how passionate God is at finding the lost than the third parable in this chapter. Verse 11 starts the longest part of Luke chapter 15. And before we go through that, it's going to be where we spend our time. Before we go through that, I just want to remind you what a parable is. A parable is an earthly story laid out alongside of a heavenly meaning. It's an earthly story that helps us understand something heavenly. So what we'll do is we're going to read through this from an earthly perspective, but then we'll walk back through it and give it some heavenly perspective. So in verse 11, we read this. Jesus continues. This is his third thought. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them, and not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had and set off for a distant country. And there he squandered his wealth in wild living. And after he had spent everything, there was a great famine in the entire country, and he began to be in need. So he went out and hired himself to a citizen of that country, who sent him out into the field to work with pigs. And he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that were in the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. The earthly story. Dad has 2 sons. The youngest son walks up to the dad and says, "Listen, I know when you die, you're going to be giving me my share of your estate. Let's act like you're dead. Give me my stuff now." And the father gives him his inheritance. And then the son looks at the family and says, "Forget you people. I don't like this house. I don't like the environment. I don't even like my city. I'm leaving all of y'all and going my own way." He says, "I want all your stuff, but I don't want you. I'm going to go live my own way." And that's exactly what he does. And he goes out and he lives a wild Vegas life. Crazy, crazy. But just like a lottery winner that has no money management, he runs out. And before long, even though it was fun for a season, he's now in famine. He has no money. He has no job. He has no hope. So he goes and finds someone in that country and says, "Hey, would you do me a favor? Would you give me a job?" And he says, the guy says, "Yeah, I'll give you a job. I'm going to have you work with pigs. And I know how you Jewish people hate pigs. Go and feed the pigs." And this guy's like, "I got no other options." So he goes out. He sits down and he starts feeding the pigs. And as he's feeding them, the pods that he has, he looks at them. And though it's pig food, he thinks, "You know what? Maybe I should eat this because I've got no other options." He was completely, emotionally, financially, and spiritually bankrupt. Now, as Jesus is telling this story, you see a wave in the crowd. You see the Pharisees moving in with a smirk on their face because Jesus is giving the sinners their justice. And you can see the sinners in the crowd starting to wave back because they can feel the message. They get the earthly story, but they also grasped the heavenly story. What is the heavenly story? As Jesus looks at this crowd of sinners, he says, "Listen, you're all like that younger son. You want God's stuff, but you don't want God. And when all that God has given you, the comforts, the protection, the hope, you say, 'Forget you,' and you go off and live your own way. And you do what you want to do the way you want to do. You do things with your body and to your body you know you shouldn't. You talk in ways, you live in ways. You even believe things because you're the boss. And you want nothing to do with me, only want my stuff. And you go and live that way. And what has living that way brought you to? Look at yourselves. You're lost. You're completely broken. You're spiritually, morally bankrupt. And you're doing everything you possibly can just to survive. You're even eating trash you would never think you would eat. Because you're realizing the reckoning of resisting God, of rebelling against God, about going your own way. And you can see and you can feel the emotion in the crowd as the sinners are faced with that reality. They faced it back then, and I think we still face it now. Because even though this was told 2,000 years ago, it's still relevant to us. I can tell you, I have often found myself living just like the younger son. I want God's stuff, but I don't want God. I love his salvation, but I want to go and live my own way. And I do things I shouldn't. I think things I shouldn't. I say stuff that I shouldn't. And I'm sure I'm not alone. So as I take in this passage, I feel myself in the crowd. Where are you? As you consider your circumstances and your situation, understand that this passage, we're only in the middle of it. This story, we're only in the middle of it. Look at how the lost son responds to the situation. Here's the earthly response. It says this: when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have food to spare? And here I am, starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father." Jesus tells this story. The sinners are moving kind of back. The Pharisees are moved forward. And Jesus says, now this is how the son responds. He realizes, what in the world am I doing? My daddy's rich, and I'm living in this trench with a bunch of hogs. Not anymore. I'm going to fix this. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to my dad. But I can't just walk back in and say, yo, I blew it all. Can I come back home? Instead, he realizes his situation. He says, listen, I definitely can't be put back in the house, I don't think. But if I tell him what he wants to hear, and if I really do apologize, maybe he'll feed me and give me a house and maybe even give me a job. So he starts back out to his house, and he's almost practicing his lines for his parents. Have you ever done that before? You've done something or you want something, and you start to prepare your statement so that you've got it crisp and clear so that when you get there, you know exactly what to say. So here this son is. He's walking on his way home, and he's like, okay, yeah, Dad, I took all your stuff and I blew it all, and I've been living with pigs, but I'm ready to get my life back in order. Could you please just let me come home and live here and maybe feed me and maybe just kind of let me back in? He's planning this all out. The crowd is hearing this, and so are the Pharisees, and so are the sinners. And I think at this time, the Pharisees are starting to get very curious about what's getting ready to happen. And I think that the sinful crowd is starting to move forward like, right, this is our response, right? We've got to go back and apologize for what we've done. And you start to see the earthly eclipsed by the heavenly in this passage. Jesus says, eventually, sinners, you're going to come to a point where you realize God's the only option. God is your only hope. If you want to survive, if you want to live, if you want to make it, you got to come back. And Jesus says this is probably what it'll look like. You're going to start to think about all the different ways you can fix it. You need to fix yourself up. You need to clean yourself up. You need to stop this. You need to stop that. You need to be completely perfect. And that's why they're practicing their penance for God. And you can almost see the Pharisees being like, yeah, you dirty fools. And the sinners are like, yeah, we're dirty fools. So what happens? I'm glad you asked. The son gets up out of the pig pen and starts walking back home. Verse 20 says, so he got up and he went to his father's. This is what's awesome. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son and he threw his arms around him and he kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quickly, bring the robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For my son, the son of mine, was dead and now is alive again. He was lost and he is found. And they began to celebrate. Who in the crowd would have expected that? This broken boy making his way back after defying and defiling his family shows back up. And the dad is looking for him. The dad is looking out. The Bible says that when his son was still a long way off, that means that the father was already looking. He was already seeking. He was already surveying the horizon. Is my boy coming home? And the boy's coming home. And you can see the sinners in the crowd moving forward and the Pharisees moving back. They are upset. Why? Because of this. The kid comes home, the dad runs out and grabs his messy, smelly, nasty, scrappy son and starts hugging him. And the kid starts to give the message. He starts to give him his statement of, I'm so sorry. And the father's like, no, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear any of that. All I want is you. And he says, listen, everybody pause everything. Pause everything. I want you to go get a robe. I want you to go get a ring. I want you to go get the sandals. He's brought right back into the family. Oh, by the way, it's getting ready to get rowdy around here. Go kill that fat calf. We are going to be partying. Why? Because my son who was dead and I had completely written off that's not how to say it. My son who was dead and had completely written us off has come back. He was dead, now he's alive. What was lost has been found. Let's celebrate. That is an awesome earthly story. But wow, what about the heavenly perspective? Jesus looks at these sinners. He looks at this crowd. He says, look, this is how God is. When you come back, he's ready. He's standing there ready for you with his arms wide open. He wants you. He doesn't care how messed up you are. He doesn't care how broken you are. He doesn't care what you've done. He wants you. You don't have to be fixed to be found. You just come home. Could you imagine what it felt like to those tax collectors, to those sinners? Probably. Because we're a lot like that at times. We're a lot like the sinners. We think we've gone so far that we've been broken so bad that it's just done. That we've lost everything. And then we realize that God says, listen, I still want you. I don't care how messy, how smelly, how scrappy you are. You don't have to be fixed to be found. I want you just how you are. And not only does he want a relationship with us, the fact that God would run to us, to see God run, it's amazing. This earthly message with a heavenly story, or this earthly story with a heavenly message conveys to us this: God loves us. God will do anything for a relationship with us. He doesn't need you to be fixed to be found. all you need to do is come home. So let's pause here. Where are you at in the crowd? First, have you ever been in a relationship with Jesus before? Have you been able, ever been able in your life to call God your Father because of a relationship with Jesus Christ? Understand that when it comes to a relationship with God, we understand as Christians that it's not about our good works. It's not about our ability to reach God. It's about God's love and his reach for us. The Bible very clearly tells us that if we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in our heart God rose him from the grave, we're saved. That means this: if we confess that Jesus is Lord and we're not, and that we need him for salvation, and we ask him for that salvation, we now have a relationship with God. I ask you, have you ever reached a point in your life where you've accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and your Savior? And if you have, where are you in the crowd? Does your life look like you're at home, or does it look like you're away? Are you doing things that you know you shouldn't? Saying things you know you shouldn't? Behaving in ways, living in ways you know you shouldn't? Listen, with all this social distancing, we have a lot of time on our hands, a lot of private time. And for many, that means a lot of social media. Just think about your history on social media. Does it reflect someone that is home with a father or away in their own country? I get it, it's hard. I understand. But I just want to say something to you. It's very easy for us to feel like we've lost it all. We've completely broken our salvation, that we've lost our salvation. That's not true. You didn't lose your salvation. You just lost your navigation. When you think about this, you might think that I've just gone too far. I'm going to tell you, maybe you've just gone far enough, and it's time to come home. You might be thinking, it's just too late. I'm too far down this road. I'm going to tell you, it's not too late. It's just the right time to turn around. It's up to you to make that decision. Remember, God is ready, God is willing, God is able, and he is looking. You don't have to be fixed to be found. You just have to simply turn around. As this part of Jesus' parable comes to a conclusion, you can see that the sinners have moved forward to embrace what Jesus has to say. And you can see the Pharisees moving farther away, disgusted by what they're hearing. Well, Jesus has something to say to them as well. Remember, there are two sons in this story. And next week, we're going to look at the older son and his response to this entire situation and what it means, not just earthly, but heavenly as well. With that, I hope you guys have a fantastic week. I hope you have fun and you make wise choices. Toby, out.